The folks at Ubisoft gave us a code to their closed beta of The Crew 2. I gave it a shot. Here's what I think. So before we talk about The Crew 2, let's talk about The Crew 1. Now, The Crew 1 had a really big map. Coast to coast in the US, basically going from Los Angeles all the way to New York, and a bunch of other places in between. It was a very fun experience if you were just driving around. But when it came to the actual control of the vehicles and the overall presentation of the game, there was a lot there that didn't live up to the expectations of most gamers. Personally, I didn't really care for it. I thought it was a mediocre experience at best, and I just really wasn't all that into it. Now, this game initially was developed by a company that a lot of people don't know too much about called Ubisoft Reflections. Now, this company originally made a game called Driver San Francisco, which I was a big fan of. The idea of the game was that you could actually get out of cars and go into other cars because you were a ghost or something, and it was actually really fun despite how weird that whole narrative structure was. Now, Ubisoft Reflections worked with Ivory Tower to make The Crew 2, so that experience I was hoping for in Driver has basically come back in this game, which was very cool to see. So let's say you're driving around really fast in your car, but suddenly you want to switch it up and you want to drive a different kind of vehicle or fly something. So what you do is you switch into an airplane mode and then suddenly you jump into an airplane. And I'm not talking like go to some other part of the map. I mean, as you're driving the car, the airplane will just appear slightly above it and then you're starting to fly. And then when you're like, you know what, I'm really high up in the air, I want to turn into a boat. Well, you just switch into a boat and your boat will fall from the sky, hopefully into some water, and you can keep driving. There's actually a sequence in this game where I turned my car into a boat while I was on top of a building and I couldn't go anywhere, but I thought it looked really funny. Now, this is one of the things I really liked about the game, being able to switch up vehicles on the fly, because you got a number of vehicles to choose from. What I was capable of trying out in the beta was an airplane, a bunch of cars, and actually a couple dirt bikes, which was pretty neat, and there was also a bunch of boats. Now, the idea of all of this stuff together is really cool, and the explanation of how you are able to float from one vehicle to the other is not really there, because even though they're attempting to put some kind of narrative into this, it mostly involves some kind of TV show, and it just falls apart. The narrative at this point isn't very interesting to me and it doesn't grab me. It's just some basic filler to get you from one stage to the next, but I don't think it's really needed. I'd prefer that they didn't focus on the story at all because I just don't think this game needs it. What I would rather they do, though, is take all that time and energy put on that and put somewhere else, like some extra vehicles, some extra detail in the world, which we're going to talk a little bit about later, and possibly more effort into the hub worlds. Now, throughout the game, there's going to be these hub worlds that you can walk around in like a first-person mode, and I am just shocked. There's so little time put into these areas. And all I'm showing you so far is from the beta, so this stuff can eventually change, but the animations on the faces are pretty bad. The texture quality is hit and miss depending on where you're looking, but some of the models for the characters they use repeat. Like right here in this sequence, there's the same female character model that they use again and again and again, when they could have just designed a couple of other models. But, you know, whatever. It's a bit of a weird feel, but it's not really end of the world type stuff, but I just felt that the animations in general seemed to be a little bit lackluster. And just like the Driver series, when you're driving down the streets and you see somebody and you try to hit them, maybe, well, they jump out of the way. And although that animation doesn't look very great, I would have hoped they did a little bit more effort into it because it just kind of looks weird. Now, all that being said, the animations being a little bit strange and whatever, that's not the biggest problem I've got. My biggest issue is the overall concept of how these vehicles control. See, the control of the vehicles is really what this game is going to be about, and I feel like they just don't feel that good. Now, you've got a whole range of different vehicles to choose from, but cars don't feel as tight as they should. Flying seemed to be the best, but even then, it wasn't exactly perfect. And it didn't really feel like there was a lot of stuff going on because they didn't throw in a lot of obstacles. As far as I've seen in the beta so far, you know, flying just takes place in the air and there's not like starships you have to avoid or whatever. Not that the Crew 2 needed that, it's just I would have rathered some more interesting abilities as time goes on. And hopefully in the actual final version of this game we see more elements like that, but as it stands right now, it's very bare bones. When I go around on the motorcycle, I mean, it's there, but it doesn't really feel any very different than anything else, and kind of just feels a little bit hollow and doesn't have a lot of weight to it. This is one of those problems when you're dealing with so many different kinds of vehicles and objects that you can drive and fly. There's not a lot going in every one of those things because you're trying to satisfy everyone's feel instead of just focusing on one and making that the best. The original Crew, to my knowledge, focused mostly on cars, and even then it wasn't very good, so seeing them move over to multiple vehicles, I just assumed they had like a better feel for that one specific drive, but it really didn't feel like it was going that way. And another problem I had as well was that the world feels very sparse. Now of course you're dealing with a really big map, but there's elements of this world that should be a little bit more detailed. For instance, I'm going to show you Niagara Falls. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Niagara Falls, not that many trees. At least there should be some buildings and stuff like that. This is one of the problems that you're going to find in this game because basically you do have a gigantic world, but it's sparsely decorated because they have to put in so much detail in such a big map, so they're really not capable of doing that. New York doesn't feel very big, New Jersey feels super small, and even though in the real world these areas would kind of look sorta similar, they don't look similar enough. It kind of feels like you're playing in a Tonka world, where it's kind of an idea of what the original world is like, but not one-to-one exactly what it would be like. Now I know there's going to be a lot of gamers out there that don't really care about that, because the game world doesn't really need to reflect the real one too much, but personally, because I've been to some of these places, it just feels awkward when you see them. And even though you kind of enjoy the overall aspect of what they are doing when they're designing a lot of stuff, it doesn't feel like enough effort went into the concept of actually making these areas fun to race in. Pretty much everywhere you go in the world feels sparsely detailed, and a lot of the other elements of it just kind of feel like a little bit of an older game, which is kind of unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. Such a big world, a lot of stuff to explore, but not a lot of detail in those worlds. Now personally, I think there's going to be a lot of gamers out there that are just kind of okay with that. There's going to be plenty of stuff to see and plenty of stuff to do, but at the same time, I feel that the map really should be a little bit more detailed in certain key areas. Now there are a bunch of places that basically have a really neat racetrack or some kind of design like that that stands out, but it's those areas in between that feel empty and hollow. Now, all this stuff being said is really based upon the beta that I played. There's a lot of interesting elements that are basically spread out, but I don't know if the game is really just going to drive the idea home. I think for them to make the game a little bit better, what they need to do is focus on tighter controls for basically all the vehicles, and maybe add a lot more elements into the game world that make it feel a little bit more detailed and complete. And on top of all of that, well, maybe something different. Now I know this is going to be a little bit of a weird thing to say, but I was hoping they would be a little bit crazier with the game world. There's certain points where the game in the main story kind of folds together and looks really weird, kind of like something you'd see off Inception, which is neat, but it doesn't really affect the gameplay. What I would have loved to see is something like what they had originally in Driver San Francisco. Being able to jump into certain people's bodies and basically live out their lives for a brief little moment and fulfill tasks was really fun. And that was something I was hoping that we would see in here, because they did show an element of just jumping from vehicle to vehicle, which felt very reminiscent of that. Anyway, I know it might seem a little wrong to take another game's philosophy and kind of cram it into The Crew, but because The Crew really didn't work for a lot of people, I was hoping that The Crew 2 would explore more elements. Now, it's nice to see that big world back again, but I hope that when the final game comes out, they've added a lot more things to do and fixed up a couple things to make them a little bit more tighter and a lot more fun to play.